Welcome to, welcome to the League of Women Voters of Colorado Immigration Task Force event on the challenges of legal migration and citizenship. We have tonight a distinguished professor. Susan Martin is the Donald G. Hertzberg Professor Emerita of International Migration. She was the founder of the Institute for the Study of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She's currently serving as the chair of the thematic working group on environmental change and migration in the Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development in the World Bank. Previously, Dr. Martin served as the executive director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, established by legislation to advise Congress and the president on U.S. immigration and refugee policy. Prior to joining the commission's staff, Professor Martin was the director of research and programs at the Refugee Policy Group, which is a Washington-based center for analysis of U.S. and international refugee policy and programs. She was the assistant professor at the American Studies Department of Brandeis University and a lecturer in the History of American Civilization Department at the University of Pennsylvania. Her recent publications include International Migration, Evolving Trends from the Early 20th Century to the Present, Humanitarian Crises and Migration, Causes, Consequences, and Responses, A Nation of Immigrants, The Migration Displacement Nexus, Patterns, Processes, and Policies, in Managing Migration, The Promise of Cooperation, Mexico-U.S. Migration Management, A Binational Approach, and Refugee Women. So that's a lot of publications. I read A Nation of Immigrants, and I'd recommend it. It gives you a thorough base of knowledge of the history of immigration policy in the United States. Dr. Martin earned her MA and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and her BA from Douglas College in Rutgers University. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much.
And I'll also mention she's a league member and the lead author on our immigration study that's currently going before our local leagues for a concurrence. So, Susan.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I think it's really important to be looking at what's happening with regard to lawful legal immigration, because so much of the coverage right now is of mass deportations, detention, issues of that sort. But knowing what's happening on the legal immigration side, I think is really, really important. I'm going to share my screen. And I think hopefully that's working. And let me just get this out of my way. So my topic is lawful immigration and challenges under the Trump policies to look at, and looking at it from a variety of perspectives. Oops. As you can see here, I'll do a little bit of an overview and then talk about the major policy shifts that are taking place, the challenges faced by lawful immigrants, and then legal and social responses to these policy changes. So the overview. We have one of the most complicated immigration system in the world. And I've looked at many, many countries as to how they deal with immigration. It's often been said that the immigration system is only eclipsed by the tax system in its complexity, which is not a good thing. That. So I want to go through some of the pathways for how people are able to get here, either legally throughout their process, or get legal status after having come without either as a temporary worker or without any uh, agreement by the government to their being here. So the most important pathway is legal permanent residence because that's the one that leads to naturalization and the ability of immigrants to become US citizens who have the right to vote and be heard on that. And we have four types of um, ways that immigrants can benefit from legal permanent residence. We have about 1 million people here each year who receive legal permanent residence. The largest number are certainly those who are coming because they're sponsored by family members already here. It's about 2/3 of all admissions. And if you take the spouses and children of those coming under the other categories, it gets even higher in terms, it's probably about 75% or so of all legal permanent residents are coming because of family connections, one way or the other. There are a number of categories within the family sponsorship system that are different. There's a group that if you are a US citizen applying for permanent residence for your family, then there are no numerical limits on how many of you can come in to the country. So it's a fairly open system in terms of numbers. If the law says that there's a specific number that should be admitted each year, but there's a caveat that others will be admitted also if a US citizen is asking to bring their spouse and their minor children. They're the ones, and their parents, which is also an interesting category. But then there are a number of categories that are limited in number and the way in which you can come in through them, almost all of which have very large backlogs at some given time during the time that somebody is trying to become a permanent resident. And so there are different ones for the children, older children of US citizens, then for the children and spouses of people who have legal permanent residence is another category. There's still another one where it's divided between by age. So it's one process for people who are still dependent on their parents, and another that's for those who are old enough to fend for themselves on that. And the probably most controversial one of the family sponsorship is that US citizens can petition for the entry of their brothers and sisters and their families. And that one is sometimes backlogged by 20, 30, 40 years because the numbers, depending on when you're applying, numbers can be very, very large. This was particularly after the amnesty in the 1990s. It would have taken about 50, 60 years for everybody to come in under that category who was qualified. And some things had to be done to try to get that system working a little bit better on that. So those are the family sponsored, and it's a large share, as I said, of the legal permanent residents. The next one is employment based, and the numbers are smaller there, and they're also capped. And so they're capped at about 120,000 per year. And that includes both the employee who's being sponsored and their families who are spouses and minor children. And so only about, I'd say, a third of the people who come in under the employment based are themselves coming in because of their economic position, because there's somebody who's deciding to sponsor them. The other two-thirds are their families. So we get to an even smaller number. And it's important to understand this because I'm often asked, well, why don't people come in legally? And one of my answers is that the immigration system doesn't really allow that for most people because almost all of the employment-based categories, under that are for people who have a college education or higher, and or coming because they're of such importance for their skills, or for their understanding of what's happening around them, that exceptions are sort of made for their admission. The first one category is actually called the Einstein category by those who are interested in this issue. And that's the first category for employment is for people who have an extraordinary set of skills that will help the US. And that's shared as in first place with people who are managers and in companies that are extremely important, and so they're considered to be really, really necessary for our economy. There are very, very few visas that are available for those who have less than a college education, and pretty much nothing for somebody who is less than a elementary school education. So that's not a real pathway for people who are coming for economic reasons and who employers want to employ because they don't have college skills, but they have other skills that are very, very useful in terms of agriculture and other things. There are also the problems that they may be wanted because they're more, can be paid less for their work, but it's very few. The third type of category is for refugees and asylum seekers. And this is the humanitarian protection pathway. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the category means and who is involved. But the one thing to know is that it is the prerogative of the president to determine each year how many refugees will come into the country through the refugee resettlement system. And right now, the number of visas available is the smallest it's ever been since the 1980s. And the visas that have been accepted are going to South Africans, white South Africans. And there are very few refugee resettlement visas for anybody else. Asylum is a little bit different. The numbers depend on how many applicants and how many people get to come into the country or are already in the country who can show that they have a need to remain in the country. And I'll get back to that. And then the other fairly controversial category are the diversity visas. It's done by lottery each year, And it only applies to people. I can say more about this also a little bit later, but it's only 50,000 visas, and it was meant to allow people who don't have family or an employment basis for coming in, don't meet the refugee status, but are in countries that have had little immigration previously. And therefore, it's to let them have a way of getting in and then creating a pathway for others from their country to get here. It was first the diversity lottery morphed from legislation that allowed people from um, Europe, mostly from Europe, people from Europe come in because their immigration was pretty much stopped in the early 20th century. But then a number of people, including myself and some of the advocacy that I did, convinced the Senator Kennedy that if there was going to be something of that sort, it had to apply countrywide, not and throughout the um, the system, and that people from Africa, in particular, should have a shot at coming into the country to give more diversity, as well as in some other cases where there are very, very few people who are able to immigrate. So those are the types of lawful immigrant pathways that are the best you can get. And about 1 million people are able to get through in that process. But there are real restrictions in terms of how people who can get those visas. So, as I said, family-based visas, it requires, do you have a family in the US already? And if so, do they have the ability to sponsor you? And that's primarily financial ability to do so, because you have to fill out an affidavit of support for the people that you're sponsoring. And that support has to go for at least 5 years. It, and if they need public assistance, for example, you can be charged with providing that public assistance or paying for it. So it's not an easy thing to do. And it means poorer people are, of course, much less likely to be able to use even the family-based visas. We also get this interesting process by which a father will come and maybe bring an older um, child who can go to, and both of them go to work. They raise enough money to be able to do the affidavit for the wife and younger children. And then every year get, the children, younger children stay with their grandparents at their home country. And then when there's enough money collected, they're able to become a permanent resident themselves. So it's not an easy process for someone who doesn't have a lot of money to do this. The employment-based visas require that you fill certain job qualifications, that there's an employer who's willing to sponsor you, unless you're in the genius, the Einstein category, which allows you to come in on your own merits and doesn't require somebody else to sponsor you. There are some certain labor certification requirements. That's mostly done to make sure that a US citizen can be doing the same job. And so employers have to advertise the positions, and if somebody who is a US citizen or a legal permanent resident applies, they have to give them priority over somebody who's coming in without those connections. And there are also priority dates, and what that means is that the State Department goes through a process of determining how many visas are available for people to come in, and everybody is given a priority date that tells them that you are eligible to come into the United States to get permanent residence, but you won't be allowed to do that until 2043. And that's your priority date for when you're expected to be able to come in to the country. Okay, diversity visas, you have to be native of the specialized designated countries that I mentioned with low immigrant rates. But you also have to meet an education requirement, experience requirement, so that you can show that you have to show that you have at least a high school education and some work experience before you're allowed. And we get millions and millions of applications for this. You can only put in one application or you're disqualified. You can't do a lot as you would in other types of lotteries. But it's the decision on who can come in is basically a lottery. You have there's no other way in which you can come in as a diversity visa person. Refugee resettlement is the main humanitarian act, and the people who are applying to come here usually are doing it through resettlement agencies. There are about 10, but there's fewer now because of the Trump ending refugee resettlement this year, pretty much. And some of them had to close up. But they're mostly either faith-based or other organizations that spend most of their time helping refugees to adjust to life in the United States. The refugees for resettlement have to meet the refugee definition, which is a well-founded fear of persecution because of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. It's very difficult to meet the standard. It's not something that is kind of easy. Most of the people who apply for refugee resettlement, unless they have some, really good information from the organization that's sponsoring them, would probably not meet the standard on it. The Trump administration, I'll get a little bit more to this later, is making it even harder to meet the definition because they're saying that women, for example, who are beaten up by their husbands and the government won't help them to deal with the situation, are not a particular social group. They're just a social problem, in effect. And so even though for many years the US did have the ability to provide asylum to people who, where it was because of their race, religion, et cetera, but I'm sorry, it wasn't because of their race, religion, et cetera, but because of their gender. But now that's become much more difficult on that. Now, the determination for that is made overseas, so they're coming into the US on their visa. And they may adjust status to a legal permanent resident after 1 year. And that's taken as a different thing than the other visas, family visas are. And that's because they initially come in without a promise. If the conditions change in their country of origin, they can be returned home during that first year. But after the first year, if they adjust to permanent residence, they have a better chance of staying. Asylum has the same definition, But the determination is made in the United States, which makes it a kind of a quasi-legal system on that. The law definitely says you have a right to apply for asylum. That is not under, that is definitely there. But whether you can prove that you are a refugee um, determines whether you will ever receive asylum. And the majority of people who apply for asylum are denied. And it's usually because they can't show that they can show they were, persecuted. They can show that they were fleeing from a conflict. They can show that they will very likely be killed. But if it's not because of their race, religion, nationality, etc., they don't qualify. If they've been tortured, they may qualify because there's a provision under the Torture Act. And then we have very, very large numbers of people coming in as what is referred to as non-immigrants. And we're getting non-immigrant visas. They're temporary visas. There are a multitude of categories. You probably have heard of the H-1B category because it's getting a lot of attention. But there are, G backwards, and then it goes all the way up to, I think it's now at maybe X or Z. So these are all different types of non-immigrant visas. And they range from people with, again, a high level of skills who are coming for that, to tourists who are coming in or business travelers who have a meeting on that. And in between are people coming for education or for marrying somebody, but not yet married, so they can't use the family-based visas, and a whole lot of other things. It's again extremely, extremely difficult to maneuver through that system, particularly if you don't have counsel to help you with it. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through this because I think I'm already over time. But there are a number of different organizations within the government. USCIS is the most important for legal admissions because it's the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. It was designed to be a separate part of the system, which would not have anything to do with with enforcement. And it was based on a recommendation that the commission that I directed made, saying that we had to separate enforcement from services. And the Congress agreed to that, but then bullocksed it up in many ways, which I can talk about and do in my books on that. But USCIS deals with both immigration and with naturalization. And there's some problems there in both of those areas right now. But the other major issue is group is the Department of State because they provide the visas abroad and the refugee resettlement issues. So let me go through what's happening, and I'll just take a few things in the executive orders and regulatory changes as to why we're seeing more limited in legal immigration since the Trump administration took over. One of them is quite obvious. It's travel bans. There are now orders targeting 90 plus countries whose citizens have been designated as being ineligible to come into the country for any long period of time. They can still potentially come in as a tourist or to, see family for, 2 weeks or things of that sort. But they have that even there's a much higher standard for giving out those visas than was applied. And so it's clearly lowering, lessening the number of people who are coming in. There's also temporary protected status and humanitarian parole. TPS is for people who are already in the United States and a catastrophe happens in their country. It can be a conflict or it can be a disaster. And the State Department, working with the other departments and the government, make a determination as to whether the conditions are so bad that the people who are here already should not be expected to leave and go back to their home countries. Humanitarian parole, on the other hand, is for people who are outside of the US and needing to or wanting to come in for very much the same reasons that the people on TPS are in. They're often from the same countries on that. And there's litigation going on for some nationalities, and because TPS and humanitarian parole have been revoked for thousands of people. And we haven't yet seen the thousands leave. But what will happen is that people who now have a lawful status because of these two programs, once it's fully underway, will become undocumented. And so they will move from one designation to another. Right now, they're still kept thought of, and the statistics show them as undocumented. But they are undocumented with permission to be in the US. So it's a strange thing that goes on. Asylum is also now almost completely gone, except for people who had already applied within the United States. But the administration has narrowed the eligibility criteria. So I mentioned that in terms of the gender-based reasons for needing asylum. It's also closed the border and making it almost impossible to apply for asylum. So the numbers are down very significantly because of that. And they fired a lot of the immigration judges despite large backlogs. So there's nobody around, or very few people around, to actually make judgments as to whether or not an asylum application is valid on that. So we're seeing, very big differences there. And then public charge. Public charge we've had from the 1600s, actually, in Massachusetts is where that concept developed. So it's nothing new. But what has evolved over time says that yes, people may be dependent on some form of public aid, but if it's for children going to Head Start, then it's fine. That's not a public charge. It's really a good thing for the country that people, get vaccinated, that that all of these things happen. So it's really only welfare that previously was considered to be a public charge. But now the Trump administration is trying to recreate what it tried to do in the first administration and make all of those other visas invalid. Another thing is that we've seen an increase in steps taken to make it more difficult for non-citizens to come in through the temporary work programs. The one that's gotten the most attention was the increase in the visa cost for the H-1B visa from about $3,000 to $103,000. And we're beginning to see what the impact of that will be, but it's likely that it's going to reduce the number of people who are coming in through the legal channels to work in the country. So what does this all mean? Okay, let me do a little bit more on the public charge rules. The history of it is pretty clear. And the things that the Trump administration is doing is pretty clear, but the impacts are not as well known. And the impacts are that it's definitely creating fear and confusion and chaos within immigrant um, households, particularly those that have a pathway to getting a green card through one of these Machiavellian, systems that we have. But they're afraid to now bring a U.S. citizen child who's here for healthcare. Even the child is welcome, but they don't know whether once the new system is able to come about, and it's not clear because of the litigation if that's going to happen or not. But they're afraid that it will mean that they'll lose their ability to get a green card because there's a public charge now and determined to be so, because not of anything different that they've done, but how the government is defining public charge. And that leads to a lot of risks for immigrants and for the communities in which they live. And so public charge has ramifications that are, really very, very interesting and very, very dangerous if things go the way the Trump administration wants them to. On the family reunification and employment-based visas, there's still problems with delays because of the way in which the system is designed to work. Um, the But there are also these increased restrictions and sort of visa scrutiny that we've had in the past. And certainly immigrants have to show that they're not going to be a threat to the United States. And that makes sense, although the way they do it is Baroque at the least. But when you have families and employment-based visa holders who are subject to extremely long and difficult screening, it means that their ability to come in and most employment visas, by the way, go to people who are already working in the United States. So it's not something which, if there's a problem with them, it's kind of too late to be doing some of these screenings for the visa. And visa limitations hindered workforce planning and employment continuity for businesses because we don't know exactly what is going to happen at any given moment. And I should say that I'm not a fan of some of the visas, the employment visas, particularly I'm pretty good with the ones that are for legal permanent residence, but the ones for like the H-1B and H-1A and all, all the numbers on it is that what I don't like is that there are too few ways that people who come under those statuses can, number one, avoid being exploited by their employers because they're so, they can easily be sent home because if they say anything about the conditions at work. And number two, there is no route to permanent residence and to citizenship. And so many of us have been arguing for many years that there should be, that if we ever do get legislation, it should allow a temporary worker who's been in the country for X number of years to apply for legal permanent residence because they're shown to be people who have made a contribution to the country. And that's gotten into legislation, to bills, but never become legislation. And hopefully it someday will. Sorry. Okay, maybe I'll end here. I was just going to talk a little bit about what the role is of community and advocacy groups, including the league, but maybe we can deal with that as part of the Q&A. So let me stop here and stop my sharing.
Thank you, Susan. That's a very hard task to explain the immigration policy in 45 minutes. You did great. Uh, Before we start, I know that if you don't mind, maybe we could go a little bit over an hour, but I
Sure,
know you
if
wanted to
people
talk
are
about,
willing to stay,
yeah.
I am.
If you want to talk about the concurrence, why don't you do that before people leave?
Okay, why don't I then say something? As you all know, of course, we're in the midst of the program planning and the survey that all leagues need to get back to the National League about their priorities. The League of Women Voters of Washington, as a result of the study that we did, has a position that is focused on immigrants. It's not focused on immigration. And that's something we need to be telling people more about. The league has a very good position on immigration, and it's allowed the league the last year to really go after so many of the problems that are that gives really address the issues on immigration. But the position is basically on, who can come into the country, how they should come in, and there's a little bit on due process, which we, overlap with in some respects. But there's very little on what happens to immigrants 5, 10, 15, 20 years after they arrive. And the league does have a number of positions in which it basically says everyone should get such and such. And that's particularly true in the health area on that. But we felt that it's a little bit too confusing for leagues. It certainly has been for my league to know when and why we can take a position and then lobby on the basis of it that is very immigrant focused and doesn't quite fit with the league's immigration proposal. So that's sort of where we are. We have materials. I don't know if you use Groups IO in your own planning, but we have some materials that are up on there. I encourage you, to look at them now rather than wait till the convention. Most people wait to the convention and then they kind of miss what's available through this process of program planning. And what we're hoping for is for local leagues and state leagues to support our concurrence. We're very flexible in terms of how we develop the concurrence and what information we should be giving out to people. We're in the process now of changing our website, which was for the Washington consensus process, and to one that's for the concurrence process now. So that within the next couple of weeks, we should have that in place, and we'll have even, videos and other things in place there. But I'm just asking you, please get in touch with me if there are any questions as you go through the program planning. And hopefully you'll agree with us. Well, we got a lot of input from the LWV US interest group or discussion group on immigration, and I'm part of the steering committee. And so we, have gotten a lot of input through that process. And I think it shows in our materials. And a lot of very positive responses. But we know that there are leaks which, are not sure about it, don't feel that they know enough about what's happening. And please let us educate you and so that we can make sure that you're doing, whatever decision you're making is because you've had the information that you need to make the decision as part of a program planning process. So that's what I wanted to say. You're muted.
Unmuted. Thank you, Susan. And I would like to tell everybody that your local league leaders should have a copy of the study. The executive summary is quite readable. The other study is a little bit a little bit long. But
I mean,
the
96 pages isn't.
yeah, it's like 95 pages. So, but really, if you have any questions, you feel free to call Susan, or else Sean or I or the immigration task force can answer them. But please talk to your local leagues and discuss whether you want to concur on the immigration position. And then if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And I have a few questions. We've heard about how difficult it is to come here legally. So does the US value immigration at this point in time?
Yes and no. I think there is a very large segment of the American population that do value immigration, and we're seeing it in the rallies and and what's happening in Minneapolis, and all of those are definitely it's risking your life to protect immigrants. So I think that I'm very positive about that. And recent surveys that have been done and on what the thoughts are about immigration, it shows that there's a high level of support for immigration. It's certainly more than half of the population on that. The no is that we're in danger of losing it because there are so many parts of of the strategy that the Trump administration is using to try to convince people that there is danger from immigration, even though the statistics are quite the opposite on that immigrants have less likely to commit crimes than U.S. born people are on that. The idea that they're taking jobs away from immigrants has also been debunked by statistics. All of the things that are used, but there are it's hard to get across this to the public, and I see what's going on now as much a democracy issue as it is an immigration issue. Because, and largely, again, we can see it in, what's going on in Minnesota and the other places which has had it is that if they can do something to immigrants, it becomes much easier for them to do it to citizens. And we are likely to lose our democracy if it's on the back of immigrants and nobody is there to protect the immigrants from that, because basically you're protecting yourself as well.
So why do we make it so hard for immigrants to come here legally?
Right. A lot of reasons, and I've been working on this issue in and out of the government and think tanks and academia since the late 1970s on that. And one of the things that is that it is difficult to gain a consensus amongst legislators about what is needed. Everybody knows actually what is needed. I take that back, but it's getting agreement on what are the solutions when it really comes down to the nitty gritty of immigration. It's again because of that complexity that we already have in the system on that. There are also vested interests that like it that we have undocumented migration, or we did more so, or that we do currently, because they can pay them less money for jobs and get more work out of them than they can do for people who have rights in the country that would stop that from happening. So you can't deny that that's a part of it because we're seeing the benefits to employers over the years in having a largely undocumented workforce on that. Another issue is that we as Americans are very thoughtful and love the fact that our immigrant ancestors came here and they were the good people. They made the country what it is. And throughout history, whether you're talking even about the US American history, if you're talking even about the colonial period, people have always been scared of the people who are coming in now because they don't know them. They're the other. And there usually aren't enough ways that people can interact with immigrants. And once they interact with immigrants, those immigrants become the good immigrants, but it's all those other people who remain the scary ones. And so without, sorry, I've just gotten. Um, So I think, and something that I think the league is really well prepared to do is more civics education that forms around getting the information out in terms of, letting people know what was said about their ancestors.
Mhm.
Because what was said about them was not rosy. It was terrible. And it was as wrong that, wrong then, wrong now. But finding ways of being able to engage with people who aren't sure of what their views are on immigration. And I think that until that happens, it's going to be really, really difficult to keep going as a nation of immigrants.
So, am I right that you were on the staff of the commission that did the last immigration reform? Is that
Yeah,
right?
and I was the research director of the previous one that
Okay.
recommended the amnesty and
So
other things. So yeah,
was the purpose of that to make immigration more diverse in the
no,
country?
no, it was really we were in a unique commission in that we had about a 5 year period of time to work it out. We started with looking at undocumented migration or unauthorized immigration to figure out what kind of changes. Our commission recommended the use of what became E-Verify, although not quite the same way we asked for it, but having an electronic way of determining whether somebody was authorized to work. And we also, had a bunch of other recommendations for either creating a legal pathway for people who were now only able to come in undocumented, or getting rid of some of the reasons that there was a pull factor in the United States for undocumented migration. So we looked at it. We then looked at legal immigration and what changes were needed in that, and we came out with a report that went through a whole bunch of recommendations on dealing with it, and some of which were enacted and most of which weren't. Um, and then we looked at refugees
Okay.
and asylum issues. And then the last area was on the integration of immigrants, and then also on the need for better institutional systems for dealing with immigration. And Congress accepted some of those recommendations and then really bollocks them. And they became worse than what it was before we made the recommendations.
Okay. Um, so because right now I see the immigration policy, at least of the administration, is to deter immigration. Do you think it's trying to deter legal immigration? I think you said it was for
It is.
refugees and asylum, but like the whole thing seems based on deterrence. So, well, let me ask you this. Could the United States absorb more legal immigration?
Oh, clearly. I mean, look at our, the numbers with the baby boomers, you know, getting out of their jobs and they're relatively few young.
I think I lost Susan.
Right. And Kathy, when she comes back, there's a question in the chat.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mary. We'll wait just a few minutes. I think she'll probably come back. While we're waiting, I just want to mention that the League does a lot of informational task force meetings and events. And if you'd like to see more of this kind of program, please donate to the League. There's a donation button on the League of Women Voters of Colorado website with a big red box up in the right-hand corner. So I'll put that plug in. I'm hoping Susan's power didn't go out or something.
She's so, oh, should be in.
Sorry about that. I'm going to keep my video off because I just got shut out of this altogether. So could you repeat the question or where we were?
Susan, while Kathy's thinking of her very wide-ranging question, we had a specific question in the chat. How do athletes coming in to play for American teams, especially soccer, get visas?
Okay, it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. They definitely, when going through this process of identifying the 90 the countries, they did make it clear that, as I mentioned, that it doesn't apply directly to people who are here for a short period of time, who would be coming in under one of those visas on that. Now, whether that message gets through to the people who are supposed to be giving the visas out in other countries is another whole issue, because they've been getting the word you shouldn't be giving out visas here. So whether they decide that no, this is an exception, it's going to be hard to know. And I think that there's probably quite a lot of angst about what's going to happen when we get closer to the time, and we're getting closer.
And here's another, can you see the chat from where you are, Susan?
Yes. Can an adult child who was naturalized, wait a minute, I just lost it.
Okay, can an adult child who was naturalized through birth sponsor his adult mother who is living in the US but is undocumented?
Yes. And in fact, that's happens all the time, although now it's become a little bit harder to do it. One of the You probably know that Trump signed an executive order that would deny citizenship to people who were here, whose parents were undocumented or were temporary workers. And that whole thing is exactly what your question gets at. Because what they're trying to do to stop the immigration is to stop the citizenship. Because if you are an adult child, now, of course, you have to, the whole idea that people come and give birth in order to get status here is ridiculous, because until you're 21, you can't sponsor a parent. And so if you want to spend 21 years waiting for your visa to come up, then you have to go to it. But it's not the best way to do this. But yeah, and
And I have a kind of a follow-up question. You mentioned earlier that we have these enormous multi-year backlogs, 40 years, 60 years. And what is that? Was that based on our numbers or our lack of people to process what was going on? What's the cause of these huge, long backups?
okay, it's partly the way the law works, because what it is that let's take the H-1B visa, because that is really, really backed up. If you want to become a legal permanent resident as a result of having an H-1B visa, one of the few ones that you can get a visa to come in here, even if your intent is to stay permanently. Usually, if you have an intent to stay permanently, you're denied the visa, but H-1B allows you to do that. So you're here, you've been working for an employer for 5 years. You tell the employer, and you have a visa until 6 years. You can 3 years and then renew it for another 3 years. But if you apply for legal permanent residence, then you can stay in the country and work for that employer and presumably other employers until your number comes up to get your legal permanent residence. So that's one of the things that creates the backlogs, is that a lot of people put in their application hoping that they'll eventually be able to get it, but knowing that it's going to take years for it to happen. But it means a much larger number of people try it. Same thing with asylum. A lot of people, well, why not? Let me try it and see. In the meantime, I'm going to be able to stay in the country and not be deported. So you get that kind of situation. But then to make it more difficult is that can a country, if you come from India, let's say, there is a definite number of visas that are assigned to each country. It's the same. It's not like it used to be, but some countries got less visas. But there are, let's say, just making up the number, is that, you're in India, India will have 500 visas available in any given year. Okay, some country with 12 people in it gets the same number. So
Why?
because of diversity, to make sure that every country has a right, because there's an overall limit on how many H-1B visas can be given out each year. And then there's a per country number. And so that per country number, then creates the problem. So the Congressional Research Service estimated about a year ago that if you today applied for legal permanent residence and you're from India, it will take you 90 years to get your legal permanent residence. if we continue with this system.
So on this same topic, excuse me, sorry, I got kicked off as well.
Uh,
Um, um, does that lead to another kind of exploitation because can they transfer it or are they stuck to the same employer?
Yeah, no, theoretically they can change employers if it's a kind of a lateral change on that. But in reality, most people don't, the immigrants don't want to risk it, that they're going to lose their place in the line if they go to a different employer. And
So-
so, yes, of course, it makes the immigrants who are in that situation much more vulnerable to exploitation because they are desperate not to be sent home.
And so what happens if they have like a health issue or something like that? You lose their status and have to leave?
Well, then that you get to what I talked about earlier in
Oh, I'm
terms of
sorry.
no, it's not. It's when you were still on, but public charge. If they're sick and they need health care, even if they um, have the money to pay for it for some specific period of time, they may still be determined to be at public charge because hospital prices are very high, on that, and therefore, they're under this new definition. It's actually even though previously that would have
Yeah.
been a potential bar.
Yeah.
By the way, since I have you here, I want to make sure that everybody knows about the webinar tomorrow that we
Oh,
have on the health and the impact of what's happening in the country on immigrants and their families and their access to health care. So I'll be moderating that.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question? Can we talk a little bit about undocumented immigration?
Sure.
Um, I read an interesting book that said that migration is tied to jobs very, very strongly. So would you say that most of the undocumented people are coming here because they can get a job? I know a lot of them are working, but um, or do you think there's a substantial portion that really want asylum, but the standard is just so high that they can't get it? So
Yeah.
what kind of proportions do you think there are there?
Yeah, but it's not so much proportions as it's mixed motivation. So you'll
Okay.
have somebody who's living in a place where there's conflict. They're actually in a place where they, have it maybe discrimination is against them, which is not persecution, but it's still
Mhm.
serious harm that's done. And so they want to leave, but their choice of coming to the US is because they have a cousin who can help them get a job.
Mhm.
Okay. Is that, I mean, how do you determine which is the predominant reason for their coming
Mhm.
um, on that? And so it's very, very complicated way of you're trying, and it makes it really hard to figure out how do you actually deal with the push and the pull factors that influence whether or not people are going to come and how they're going to come. And so is it is it actually persecution? We have a lot of different ways of defining who is in need of um, protection
Mhm.
from harm, but not always, they don't always work. And when you're actually looking at an asylum application, which I've done a lot of, and and very often the other thing that happens is that the conditions here change as well as the conditions in their home country changes on that. And so what might have been a very valid application for asylum on day one by five years later, it's no longer a valid reason. But that doesn't mean that the person who's been here for that period of time doesn't have a good reason to stay in the country.
Right.
The problem is that there is no pathway for them to do that, and then they become, seriously undocumented.
Right. What about, are there different, when we talk about undocumented immigrants, people generally jump to the southern border, but aren't there a substantial number of people coming from other entry points, and do they have different reasons for coming here?
Yeah, actually, for quite a long time, the majority of people who we would label as undocumented came through the legal ports of entry into the United States on the border. And so they were people who may or may not have had an intent to remain in the United States, but they were on a visa that got them in, but didn't give them any future. And so after, their 3 months were up because they were a tourist and they had fallen in love with, this place that they were living, during that period of time. There might not necessarily be a way that they could remain legally here. And so they moved from being somebody who they actually, I don't like undocumented. I use it because people know it. But the thing is that the majority of people who are, quote, undocumented are fully documented by the US government.
Okay.
So what it is that they don't have the right documents. It's not
Okay.
that they're undocumented.
Okay.
That,
That's interesting.
but so it's people who came, in by air. They got to an American airline, or they came over from Canada or things of that sort. But then, and they decided they wanted to stay. And over time, 10, 15, 20 years, they feel like they're American and they have children who were born in the US. So, the whole thing sort of, moves from one to the other in doing this. And then there are others who come with the intent to, get a job, and they don't have any other reasons. And most of them, it's not getting a job that is the issue, because it's very expensive to migrate, whether it's done legally or without authorization to do it. And so it's mostly the middle class or lower class of the people who of the country that they're coming from, who are the ones who move, and because they have the resources to get to here. But what they know is that if they stayed in Mexico, they would get 1/6 of the wages that they will get if they're doing the exact same job in the United States. So
Right. And
that's the pull.
right. Even if they are going to be exploited and at least now hunted.
Right. But the other big pull factor for, or push factor actually for this are your children. Whether they're born now or going to be born sometime in the future. It's that a lot of immigrants, and I've had interviews over the years, talking, sitting down with groups of immigrants about, what would make them, in Mexico or in, other countries, sitting down with those and, and I'd ask, how many of you would like to come to the United States? And you get everybody puts their hand up. And then I ask, well, if if you can't do it legally, how many would go? And you get down to about half of the people. And then I say to those who have, why is it that you are willing to come to the US even if you have to do it, without documentation on that? And then you would get the stories of, well, I want a better life for my children. And that's why I'm willing to take what are lower wages in the US, but are much higher wages for me in Mexico. Or I talk to a lot of people where it's the conflict, and it's usually I have to get my children out of this place because it's too dangerous for them.
Yeah,
So it often gets back to that kind of of decision making.
right.
Never one issue. It's
Yeah.
always a whole range of things, because it's making a big decision.
Yeah, it is a big decision. Do you force, uh, could you talk a little bit about, I know that they, and I can't think of the word right now and it's driving me crazy, but where you let the people who came here without the proper documentation, um, stay. What's that called again? Um,
Amnesty?
Amnesty, right,
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
Can you talk about the last amnesty and
Sure.
what the
Know
effects
a
of that have been?
lot about that one because that was based on the recommendations of the first commission I worked on. Yeah, that was there were two different ways people could get legalization, which is the term that most of us prefer to amnesty. So, to get legal status on that. One way, which was the larger one, and it was about 3 million people, could show that they had been in the country for long enough. There was an amount of time they had to have been in the US, and that they, promised that they would learn about U.S. civics and study English, and there were programs established, and they had a show in order to go from being legalized to becoming a legal permanent resident. They had to show that they had taken these tests and they knew something about American history and all of that sort of stuff. What we do for naturalization, this was done for legal permanent residents on that. And they had to show that they could support themselves and a variety of other things. The second one was for agricultural workers. And that was filled with very fraudulent applications. And most of the people who were putting in fraudulent applications were, so unknowing of what an agricultural worker did that they were able to, say no, this is not you. This is not what happens in the Mexican fields or something of that sort. But it gave a bad name to legalization because of that. Um, and so, and there, I think it was, I could be wrong on the number, but I think it was about 1 million people did get through the system on that.
When was that?
They just had to show that they had been farm workers over a certain number of years, and then they met the rest of the criteria.
Mhm. When were those
These were in the late 1980s, so 86 to
so it's
8.
been like almost 40 years or about 40 years since that
Yeah,
happened. So
yeah,
we
there
have
have been many legalizations. For example, in when all the conflicts in Central America were being settled,
Mhm.
the Congress passed legislation that allowed people who had been here for a certain number of years um, eh, to remain here without and become permanent residents. So there is a process for that
Oh, okay.
on that, and also for Haitians. And when after the the change in government there. So there have been little ones for specific groups, but the big, amnesty for everybody who was here undocumented for at least 3 years or longer was a long time ago.
So, like, can you say something about how many people, or about how many, or what proportion of people have been here for long terms, like 10 years or more?
The majority have been here for more than 10 years. It's a little bit less now than it was before the large number of people who came during the Biden administration. So the numbers aren't, the percentages aren't quite the same way. But because we had a lot of new arrivals that we didn't have previously on that. But a large part of that number that have been here at least 10 years have been here for 30, 40 years. There's a provision in the law that does say that if you have been here for more than X number of years, you can apply for it to remain here permanently on that. But the number of years has always been longer than people's lives. So it's really hard to meet the criteria, but we're getting there now. And there are some suggestions. A number of advocacy groups are saying, well, maybe we can get some type of piece of legislation through Congress that, because people don't really understand this very well, that would lower the age, the number of years you had to be in the country to, let's say, 5 years or even 10 years. And then everybody who was here for longer than that would be eligible to at least apply for permanent residence if they met all of the other criteria.
Can you say something a little bit about anchor babies and what that is, and does that still apply?
Well, I don't like the term anchor baby because that's really not what's happening. But it
Okay,
is
sorry.
what is happening, though, is that you do have once somebody from a family or it's actually, I mean, I can tell this about my father is an immigrant, so I can tell this, and he was, I'm old, so this was the turn of the 19th to 20th century, that we had that same kind of issue, and that there was somebody from his village who came to the United States. He got through Ellis Island, and he was asked, what name do you want in America? Because the name you have from the shtetl in Poland is not, it's not acceptable here. People won't understand it. So they asked him what his religion was, and they gave him, as he was Jewish, they gave him an Old Testament and said, open it up and find a name. He opened it up to the Book of Solomon. So he said, okay, my name is Solomon. The last name is Solomon. He wrote back to the villagers, his friends, and said, when you come into the United States, you can miss a step if you just tell them that your last name is Solomon. And so I remember as a child going to a party that was for people from the same village that my father came from, and I couldn't believe I had so many relatives because all of them's last name were Solomon. And then my father told me the story. So that's the first guy was the anchor,
Uh-huh.
and it was because he was here and was able to find jobs for those who came. He certainly got his own family to come in. My family came in droves because they had to keep waiting to have enough money to pay for the transport and then for the other fees and stuff that they had. And so then, once my grandmother came also. It's about the same time to help with her sister's children. She then married and brought over her husband, who then brought over his family, who then brought over their in-laws, and that's the way life is, but that's a good thing. It means that people, and compared to other countries where this doesn't happen, is that every immigrant who comes into the United States one way or another because of family or because of employment, whatever it is going to have people here who can help them adjust. They're not going to be thrown into the situation. And they're in a way, it is maybe elitist, but the people who do initially come in generally tend to be those who have more gumption. They're willing to risk things. We end up with 25% of what's called the thing you get when you have a um, I'm like you.
Yeah.
I forget words and then I can't get them back. But anyway, we have a very high, the entrepreneurship of
Yeah.
immigrants usually is because of this process that we go through. And if you have people who are themselves educated, and they're able to come into the country, you're going to have a whole lot more people having various different awards and being able to show that they're really, really good because they have a community to get into.
Yeah, and that leads to, I think, what I'll have as the last question. I really appreciate all your information that you've given. You talked about integration and that's sort of the focus of the concurrence. Um, and you hear a lot of people say, well, you know, they need to speak English or they don't speak English, so we don't like them or something like that. Um, but can you talk a little bit about how by the second generation, immigrants' children are succeeding and sort of the integration of the first generation and then the integration of the family?
Right. Yeah, well, you basically said it. I mean, this is something that um, we see happening over and over again. But what I would add to it is it's that not that the first generation doesn't want to learn English. Problem is that even in a state like Washington, or I'm sure Colorado as well, there just aren't enough services to help people learn English. That they're few and far between. The number of people who immigrate who really need to be in a English language learning program much higher than the number of programs that exist.
Mhm.
And so it's not because they don't want to speak the language, it's because they don't have an opportunity to learn it on that in many cases, not all. And we've seen over history, time that there are enclaves and people come in from Russia, come in from Poland, come in from Italy, whatever, and they are feeling that they are more secure if they're in a community that are from people from the same ethnicity. And then the need for language for the learning English is less
Mhm.
needed on that. But by the second, I mean, I'm often asked, why has America been so successful as a nation of immigrants? Not that it always has been, because there were some really dark times. But one of the things I always say is that birthright citizenship is probably the most important thing because you're an immigrant for only one generation.
Mhm.
And that opens up so many possibilities. And one of the possibilities is for the second generation to have all of the rights of citizenship.
Mhm.
And that's why this whole idea, and a lot of the discussion on birthright citizenship has been a legal discussion. But one of the op-eds that I wrote when it first came out was that it's bad for us as a country to end birthright citizenship because all of the benefits of it will not be there, but the people will still be there. It's not that they're going to suddenly leave because, their sister who was born after this, is not a citizen. And so anyway, I think we need to understand, I'm not trying to be saying that everything about immigration is good. I'm actually one of the people who is very, very much against undocumented migration and believe that there should be serious enforcement done on it. But it's not because I think there's anything bad about the people. And I think after they've been here for a certain time, they definitely should have a pathway to citizenship, legal permanent residency and citizenship. But it's so having a cadre of people who do not have the same rights that everybody else does, and who are in fear and who are exploited is not the way to run an immigration system.
Mhm.
And I feel very strongly that we shouldn't, as members of society, think that it's okay that we have a large number of people who are here illegally. It's terrible that that's happened. But there are different ways of addressing it. And for me, it's to provide legal pathways. Not everybody's going to come in because not everybody's going to meet the criteria. But people who should come in should be able to do so legally, not illegally.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there needs to be a due process, and the immigration courts are just not functional right now.
Right. Nothing is functional right now in the immigration system in the US. Unfortunately, too many countries around the world are taking our example right now, and they're closing on immigration, and it's really kind of scary because, particularly for refugees, because there's no place to go.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Susan. This has been awesome. I really appreciate it. I think everybody's learned a lot, and hopefully your concurrence will become a national position. And
So,
yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
welcome. Thank you all for staying on.
Oh,
And sorry for talking so much.
No, we
No.
really enjoyed it. Thank you. It was a
Okay,
really good program.
all right.
Great.
Good
Okay,
night,
bye.
everybody.